Dr. David Weldon, it is such an honor to be here with you today.
When I went to Congress, I took a pay cut, okay?
You are the only one who can tell this story well because you were there.
They need to reform the 1986 Act.
The American people need a CDC that they can trust, and they don't have that right now.
And that was part of the reason I wrote my letter. I always felt Wakefield was dealt with wrongly.
It's a complete distortion of free markets.
When it comes to vaccines, there's no duty to really investigate the safety.
Yeah.
Basically, Uncle Sam, the taxpayer, is going to pick up the tab if something goes wrong with this vaccine.
I'm Nicole Shanahan. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public. Dr. David Weldon, it is such an honor to be here with you today. Your story is, I think, the modern American story. You spent time serving in our military. You're an internist. You spent 14 years in Congress. You are a model American in every possible way. You're a devout Christian, and you're an active physician still at Health First Medical Group in Florida. And you are now famous. I did not know much about you until I actually read your exit letter and really spent time. I knew a bit about you when you were nominated by President Trump to serve as our next CDC director. And I have to say, Dr. Weldon, that 12 hours before your confirmation hearing, when I heard that you were no longer going to sit before the Senate committee and give your testimony on why you would make probably America's best head of the CDC, restore honor to that department, a department, an agency that 40% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans do not trust anymore. You are going to restore trust in it.
I'm glad you started with that because that really was, one of my primary goals. And I thought the best way to achieve that was through transparency and high quality research and not calling people anti-vax and not calling people um, names, but actually listening to the public. Another amazing figure, the CDC is now recommending COVID shots for little children, and 90% of parents are refusing these shots. Now, are we going to say 90% of the American people have it wrong? At some point, you have to say maybe the American people have it right and CDC has it wrong. And maybe a lot of people at Pharma who are trying to promote all these vaccines have it wrong. So I wanted to try to get everybody together and get everybody singing from the same sheet of music. I was very disturbed by the lack of confidence in CDC. The other analogy I like to point out, I'm still practicing medicine, part-time, but I still practice medicine. If you're a practicing physician and anything below 92% of your patients approve of you, like let's say you only have a 85% approval rating from your patients, you are considered um, a troubled physician. The average doctor is approved by their patients 96%. Otherwise, the patients wouldn't be there in the office. And so, yeah, it's a real crisis. It's a real problem, and I wanted to try to turn it around.
You were 12 hours from going before that first committee and for this country to see and actually get to meet you. And you get a call from the White House saying that your nomination has been rescinded. And I mean, I can't imagine how that must have felt, Dr. Weldon.
Oh, it was, like being punched in the head. I mean, just for your viewers, okay, I got nominated November 22nd, and I began a preparation process. And the 4 weeks leading up to that hearing that got canceled, I was basically staying in a hotel in Washington, D.C. and living out of a suitcase because they want you to meet with all the senators on the committee. And a lot of times they move the appointments around. And so you just have to be available. And so I was doing a lot of research, a lot of meetings for a very, very long time, and thought I had a problem with the confirmation, basically coming from Senator Cassidy, maybe one or two of the other committee members, but to just get it, at the 11th, literally almost the 11th hour. It was 10 o'clock at night,
Mm,
and my hearing was 10 o'clock in the morning. And this poor staff guy at the White House was tasked with the responsibility of telling me, "No, we're withdrawing your nomination." And of course, that's the news line that Trump withdrew my nomination. Well, Trump withdrew my nomination because there were people, specifically Senator Cassidy, who didn't want me, and specifically didn't want me because I wanted to do some more research on vaccine safety,
mhm.
and the rest is history.
Well, Cassidy has a lot of people right now who want him to step down and find him a bit treasonous for interfering with what the American people want. The American people need a CDC that they can trust, and they don't have that right now. And the reason they don't trust it is because of a plurality of reasons, which you so beautifully, and if our listeners haven't read this yet, this is it's the official statement of Honorable Dave Weldon, MD, regarding recent withdrawal of nomination for CDC. And I read this and I couldn't help but get very emotional because you discuss how we got here, and you give a few examples, really, really good examples. And these are lived examples. You know these characters in DC very well because you spent nearly 15 years working on the Hill. And what you describe is you describe a situation in which by far Big Pharma is the largest presence in DC lobbying, and you describe having relationships with some of these people that then turned on you. You Dr. Bill Cassidy. He's also an internist. Um, and you once considered him a friend.
I did. I actually went to a Christian couples retreat with him and his wife, and my wife got to spend time with his wife. Now, just because you're Christians doesn't mean you can't disagree on policy and issues. But it was a little surreal to find myself opposed by a colleague, essentially. Now, Rand Paul is also a physician, ophthalmologist, not an internist, but and he was foursquare trying to help me. There's another irony in all this that I didn't include in that letter. The CDC director was historically just hired by the secretary. So Bobby could have had me in there at the CDC 3 or 4 weeks ago. The two principal people who wanted to make the CDC nominee confirmable, okay, and that's called presidential appointed, Senate confirmed. It's a special category. Cabinet officials and key sub-cabinet officials were Tuberville from Alabama and Rand Paul himself, and they were both supporting me. They both wanted me in the position. Um, and of course, we all know what happened. I was going to be the first one to face Senate confirmation, and it didn't go as planned, at least as Bobby Kennedy wanted. And
And many millions of Americans wanted, including myself. There's there's a story you tell in your letter about, Dr. Andy Wakefield that I actually didn't have the full background of. And I had the pleasure of meeting Wakefield last year. Um, like most Americans and, parent of a child with an autism diagnosis, I was told to ignore Wakefield, that his research was bad. And
Right.
so I did. I ignored it for a good number of years. And in your letter, you describe his co author, an Irish virologist, O'Leary, who he co published one of Wakefield's 15 papers. So Wakefield published 15 papers, and only one was withdrawn. It was that famous paper in the Lancet that he co published with O'Leary. And you describe with great detail the PCR, um, and the samples and how they showed strains of the virus in the vaccine strain measles virus in the biopsies, in the bowel biopsies of the children.
Yes.
And so, you yourself looked at the results.
Yes, that was, you know, I it amazes me to this day. I actually sat down with O'Leary, and PCR, it stands for polymerase chain reaction, and he clearly showed that these were vaccine strain viral particles infecting the intestinal tract of these children. And it caused many parents to start refusing the measles vaccine, the MMR, in England. And then, of course, they started having measles outbreaks. And British health officials basically pressured O'Leary into withdrawing his um, statements in the paper, and the Lancet withdrawing the paper. And so and then they went after Wakefield's license. So the tagline, and the media is always repeating it all over the place, that paper was withdrawn, Wakefield lost his license, portraying him as being this disreputable, unethical person. And it couldn't be further, the truth couldn't be further from that. I mean, it's breathtaking. Thank God for the internet, and thank God for podcasts like yours. And I have invitations to do more of these down the road, because more and more people are getting very, very well informed. And it's only going to undermine and cause more problems for CDC if they don't face this head on. What I wanted the CDC to do way back then, 20 years ago, was to just repeat Wakefield's study. Just do the bowel biopsies, send the specimens off, do the PCR, because that's the way science is supposed to work. Science is supposed to work when you publish a sort of a revolutionary, iconoclastic, different kind of result. You want to get somebody to try to repeat it. And a lot of times it can't be repeated. And it's ultimately shown that there were problems in the original way the original study was done. But they have never even wanted to repeat this study. Nobody will dare to repeat this study after what happened to the participants in the study, who were threatened with losing their licenses and ruin. They were essentially threatened with complete ruination. And so Wakefield published 15 papers, only one was withdrawn. The other 14 papers still stand. It is still a clinical syndrome described today, where parents will have children, and maybe they've gotten some vaccines, and they scope them, and they have this inflammatory bowel condition. And so anyway, I can go on and on in the science in this,
Yeah.
but it's a tragedy. And part of the reason I wrote that letter is I always felt that Wakefield was a caring, intelligent, ethical scientist, and he was basically destroyed by Pharma and the British version of CDC officials.
And you called O'Leary, the co-author that agreed to retract his findings from the micrographs and the PCR.
I had to call him.
You called him. And you had a very personal, conversation with him, and I've actually heard of similar stories of a doctor or a researcher calling another doctor or researcher, and really having these, you know, secretive conversations about why they're making certain decisions to withdraw research. I mean, I've there's, one researcher here in California who has great data, and she's kind of releasing it, like, very slowly and has to be very careful with her language, and she's not releasing all of it, and she's not releasing all of her findings or her theories because she's afraid of ruin, because it's scary.
It's true. These scientists, they typically have a mortgage to pay and a car payment to pay, like the rest of us. And and so they have to be careful with what they say. Marty McCary, who's been now confirmed as the FDA director, has a great book called Blind Spots, and he talks about one of my favorite scientists. His name is Marshall, Barry Marshall. He's from Australia, and he had this idea that peptic ulcer disease, stomach ulcers, duodenal ulcers, are an infectious disease,
Mhm.
and he promoted it for years and years, and he was ridiculed for 2 decades until it was ultimately shown he was correct. Now we treat you come in to see me with an ulcer, we get the biopsy. If you've got the infection, if you've got the ulcer germ, we treat you with antibiotics. What's totally amazing about that particular story is ulcer disease used to be very common, and it's not as common now. We just don't see as much of it. And the reason we don't see as much of it is because we treat it properly as an infectious disease. And so if you get that germ in you and we treat it, you're less likely to pass it on to somebody else. And so the world, the and this guy won the Nobel Prize, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Marshall actually was awarded the prize in medicine. It's probably saved millions of people from getting ulcers, but, he was ridiculed for years. So when you're a scientist and you're doing research, you have to be looking over your shoulder to make sure you're not, upsetting the chairman of the department or the in the case of this vaccine stuff, you don't wanna offend, big pharma, the vaccine manufacturers. They spend over $440 million a year on lobbying.
Oh my god.
That's how powerful and influential they.
Imagine how much they could make if they focused on treatments, on, 450 million investments into new innovative treatments to all of these diseases, focusing that in research versus effectively what is buying off politicians to keep the science from progressing and effectively threatening good people, such as yourself, from progressing. And but let's go back to Wakefield. There was a third person that you mentioned, Dr. Simon Murch, in your letter. This is why I love your letter, because you show us precisely what is wrong with the CDC through this story. This story that you are uniquely positioned to tell. You are the only one who can tell this story well because you were there.
I was there, I was following the whole thing,
Yeah.
um, and now it's not the kind of thing, like the Super Bowl everybody's watching, but yeah, I was there.
They're watching now. It's a because there's so many affected children, and this science has been buried for decades. But let's talk about Dr. Simon Murch, who was the lead co-author with Dr. Wakefield on these publications about inflammatory bowel disease linked to the MMR. Dr. Simon did have his license taken away, but he fought it because he had money to fight it, and he won.
Wakefield came to the United States to do research in the United States, but Murch was still there on the faculty at the hospital, and he had an insurance policy.
Ugh,
And if he felt that they were taking his license away for false reasons, he could get the insurance company to pay to defend him. And actually, I found out from Wakefield after I sent that letter out, there was another doctor who was in the same boat who was also on the paper. So they tried to take 3 different doctors' licenses away, and the government failed in court, and they did not take their licenses away. Now, Wakefield had left, so he wasn't part of the litigation, and they took his license away because he was now living in America. But if you look at the court documents, and I understand it wasn't really a court, it was sort of an administrative hearing, but it's all public record information. The people in the government who were trying to take their licenses away failed to demonstrate in that proceedings that these researchers did anything wrong. And and if you actually read the paper, it doesn't appear as though they were doing anything wrong, but yet and what I like to say is that's all the Pharma needed. They could say Wakefield had the paper withdrawn, Wakefield lost his license. So, you know, innocent people will just assume he's an unscrupulous, unethical physician, where it couldn't be further from the truth. And that was part of the reason I wrote my letter. I always felt Wakefield was dealt with wrongly, and his research needed to be repeated. It needs to be repeated now. I don't know who Bobby Kennedy is going to get in at CDC. The current news reports is that it's going to be the acting Susan Maneras.
yep, Susan Marinares,
Um, and we need to get to the bottom of a lot of this stuff surrounding mercury and surrounding the MMR and the safety of the MMR.
and Wakefield's response to this entire controversy was that if we waited on the MMR a few more years or, gave the vaccine and separate strains instead of combined strains, that the kids would, far fewer children would have adverse reactions.
Yeah, I spoke to him because I said, we've got to give the measles shot. The measles can occasionally kill, and it can leave some children disabled. And um, if you look at a lot of European countries, they give it at a later age. And one of the theories was that giving it at 12 or 14 months is a little too early. Maybe you need to give it at 16 or 18 months when the child's immune system is more fully developed. But the complicated issues in all this is the Vaccine Act does not acknowledge, even though I've had hundreds of parents say to me, my kid was developing normally, he was saying mama, dada, smiling, and then just became a neurologic disaster and ultimately was diagnosed with autism. And the event that took them down was the MMR, but that is not recognized by the vaccine court. And so the parents with this type of story get absolutely nothing from the vaccine court, get absolutely nothing from the government. If this is true, if the MMR does cause an autistic-like syndrome, a bowel condition
Or
in a
co-occurring condition as the American Pediatric Society calls it now.
right, if it really does do that in a small percentage of kids, because obviously most kids, handle the MMR fine. Uh, one of the solutions is to separate them out, give the measles, mumps, and rubella separately, or just give it at a later time. And it could result in a dramatic reduction if this is causing it in some of the kids. And by the way, I have never thought autism is just caused by mercury or autism is just caused by the MMR. I've had some people come in and tell me their child had a bad reaction to the
Decaf,
DTP
yeah.
or the DTAP. And I actually take care of an adult patient who was damaged with an autistic-like syndrome, but that child actually got compensation from the court. Um, but we have to give these vaccines. They're needed, but can we do it smarter? And the people who are injured, the children are injured by the vaccines, can we be a little more generous in the court in how we handle them in terms of compensation? I'll never forget, I once went to the floor of the House and gave a speech criticizing the vaccine court as being basically too restrictive. And after I gave my speech, a guy by the name of Henry Waxman came up to me on the floor of the House. Um, and you may be too young to know who he
I
was,
don't
but
know
he
who
was a
yeah.
yeah, he was a very well-known, very liberal Democrat congressman from California. And and he was one of the people who wrote the Vaccine Act. And he came up to me apologetically. So I'm a conservative Republican. He's a liberal Democrat. I'm denouncing the vaccine court as being too restrictive and not compensating more of these parents. And he's coming up to me and apologizing to me. And he says, Dave, I really didn't want it to be the way it turned out. He said, I wanted it to be more liberal. And that just really spoke to my heart because, you know, I have a lot of liberal friends. I like liberals. Just because I'm a conservative doesn't mean, the old expression is if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're older, you don't have a brain. And, I think there's a little bit, for me, a little bit of liberal and conservative in me. And Waxman comes up to me and says, I didn't want it to be, uh, that way. I wanted it to be more liberal. But
Mhm.
anyway.
Well, and we have Bernadine Healy, who was at the NIH in the early 2000s calling for screening. She's like, we can screen for at risk populations. We can understand biomarkers that indicate which children are going to have an adverse reaction and a potentially severe adverse reaction to certain vaccines. Those studies aren't happening right now. That science is being suppressed. Those voices aren't being heard.
No, they're not. There was, a very interesting article in the New England Journal, published about 6 months ago by some of the, uh, sort of grandfathers of the modern American vaccine program. One of them's, Dr. Plotkin. He's a very famous
Yes, of course.
vaccinologist, in his 80s now, and they actually called for, in their article, more research. I remember when I was in the House and advocating for this, I had the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee to come up to me on the floor of the House, and they were so stingy in the vaccine compensation program and denying so many of these claims that they had accumulated, I think it was like a $6 billion surplus in the vaccine account, the vaccine so this is each shot you give, there's a tax that goes into that compensation program that is to pay for these rare cases where people have a bad reaction. And I'll never forget the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee came up to me and said, we're just not spending that, and we have all these other deficits, so we're going to divert the money over. And is that okay with you? With me? And I was very honored the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee would actually come up, and I said something like, I care about the deficit. I care that they're not compensating these families sufficiently. I care that we're not getting the right kind of research done. But, Mr. Chairman, I understand what you have to do. But Um, it they the reforms that need to be pursued are extensive. One of the most important reforms, in my opinion, is they need to reform the 1986
Yes.
Act, which basically gives blanket indemnification to these pharmaceutical companies. If I'm the CEO of a pharmaceutical company and you come to me and you have a new pill, I have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure before we release that on the market that it is safe. Because if we get claims and litigation based on that pill, it can hurt, not only me and my position as the CEO and any stock options that may have been available to me, but all the stockholders, because when you're the CEO of a stock company, you sort of have to look out for all the people who are investing in the company. I mean,
It's a
it's a good
fiduciary
thing.
duty.
It's their duty. But when it comes to vaccines, there's no duty to really investigate the safety of the vaccines.
Yeah.
It's actually in the best interest of the stockholders to do minimal research and to get it out on the market because basically Uncle Sam, the taxpayer, is going to pick up the tab if something goes wrong with this
It's a
vaccine.
complete distortion of free markets. It's the biggest
It
distortion
is.
of free markets we probably have operating right now in the United States because the market for the vaccines is huge. And without proper checks and balances as it relates to holding the free market, because the free market will hold the company accountable, but the free market can't.
Yeah, yeah, it does. I think it mostly works pretty well, and our legal system works pretty well. But, you know, this is a little problem. And what you just reminded me of one other thing. They have this CDC program. It's called Vaccines for Kids, I believe is what it's called, or the Childhood Vaccine Program. But the CDC actually purchases $9 billion worth of vaccines every year from the manufacturers and distributes those vaccines out for free to the state health departments, which then turn around and distribute them through the county health
Well, it's
departments.
not free, it's taxpayer dollars, but it's just a different vehicle, right?
Yeah, well, it's a good program. There were problems in the 80s, I believe it was, or early 90s with low income families not vaccinating their kids, and there was some outbreaks of childhood diseases. And so it's a good program. But when you have a manufacturer over here selling billions of dollars worth of vaccine to a federal agency over here, are the interests of the children really being properly monitored? And this is really big business now. Um, I'm not saying I want to do away with the vaccine program for kids, but we really need to go back and look at the 86 Act and what kind of reforms need to be made. There's another problem I really have with the vaccine compensation program in that the parents have to go against the Justice Department and the Justice Department lawyers. And if you know anything about lawyers, it's all about winning. It's like tennis players and golfers. It's win, 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 win. So you've got these government funded Justice Department lawyers taking on a mom and a dad with a vaccine injured kid. And their goal and agenda is to deny the compensation
That
of
is
that.
cruel.
It
That
is
arrangement is cruel, flat out. There's no other way to describe it.
it's wrong. It should, in my opinion, it should be taken out of the Justice Department. It should be a separate system. It should be, a committee that makes the decision. And it's just it's a bad situation, and I think 10% of parents today in America are refusing the the measles vaccine. 10%. which is not good. You know, they say, herd immunity, you have to get 95% vaccinated. So now we're only vaccinating about 90%, and it's probably only gonna get worse because they took me out, and a lot of people saw that, and I wrote my letter, and a lot of people are reading that, and now I'm doing another one of these programs in 3 days.
Well, you have a very balanced and common sense perspective. You have the perspective that doctors you know, grew up with had this, looking at the situation and a person as a whole person, not just a data point at the CDC. Like these are individual lives, these are whole families that are being torn apart by adverse reactions, and you take that into consideration. And I have to say, Dr. Weldon, America really missed out with you in this position, and I am sad for all of us. I pray that Susan Menarez,
Well, we still have Bobby Kennedy,
we have
don't
Bobby
forget.
Kennedy in there, but the CDC is a really important role, and it will only be as good as the director is courageous.
And it does take courage, you have to be willing to take on, you know, these powerful entities. One of the things I always considered, was one of my strengths was I when I went to Congress, I took a pay cut, okay? Most people think it's a gravy train, you get into Congress, you get paid all these big bucks, and then you become a lobbyist, and I know a lot of people do that, and they spend their congressional time into, uh, fortune and all, but for me, I wasn't really interested in becoming a lobbyist, nor was I interested like my colleague from Florida, Joe Scarborough, at becoming a news anchor or anything like that. I just wanted to go back to practicing medicine. That's all I wanted to do. And I knew that whenever I did leave, I was gonna get a pay raise and my hours were gonna be shorter. So I always just tried to do was right, what I thought was right for my district, what I thought was right for the American people, what I thought was right for the nation. And that was part of the reason I took on the vaccine safety stuff. The other reason is a lot of these moms came to me and said, nobody will pay any attention to us. Nobody will listen to us. And some of those moms, I want to point out, were not just moms. They were doctors who were moms who claimed their baby was developing normally until they got the shot. It's one thing if the mom is just, a housewife, but when the mom is giving you the exact same story the housewife gives you, and she happens to be an ophthalmologist, you have to say to yourself, well, maybe there's some truth here. Maybe there's some merit to this. Maybe we need more research. Maybe we need to really ferret out the truth. Um, and, that's what I tried to do when I was in Congress. And that's what I was looking forward to doing at the CDC. Hopefully, under Bobby's leadership at HHS and President Trump in the White House, we will, finally get some answers to some of these big questions.
Yeah. It's just also we have some of the answers. It would just be really nice if the government acknowledged them as well.
Well, yeah, the government, as Churchill used to say, democracy is a terrible system. It's just the best system we've been able to come up with. There is a better system, in my opinion. That's a good king, but good kings very rarely have good sons. And of course, some people say the only good king is King Jesus. And so, but anyway, the government, we're just talking about one small problem with the government. I mean, there's lots of other uh, really bad problems with the government, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, you most of us can keep government out of our home, but when it comes in, you really feel where its errors lie. Um, Well, Dr. Weldon, thank you so much for your time today. Please keep talking to the American public. Let them know who you are and your experiences, and keep writing because you're also a beautiful writer.
Well, thank you, Nicole. And I want to thank you for encouraging me by having me on your show. Um, and my wife, who is a fan of yours, she was just tickled that you were going to have me on your program. So
Oh,
God,
thank you.
God
Yeah,
bless
thank
you.
you to
And
her.
thank you very much.